Well, one of the biggest questions in science, and we're talking about across the board, is what is consciousness?
Sure.
And there's all sorts of different approaches, from the purely materialistic to the purely spiritual. Nobody knows. And I'm just reminded of the fact, I think it was Ambrose Bierce, who was a fiction writer, wrote a great humorous book called The Devil's Dictionary. And the idea of the mind is the only thing that studies itself. The mind studies everything else, but, we're trying to study ourselves, which makes it really difficult. I always have to point out the fact that people talk about, goes back to this, whether psychology is a science. It's a social science. There are completely different ideas and models of the mind in psychology that are often in conflict with one another. And there are those kinds of conflicts in physics as well. So when people say to me, well, you have no evidence, it's like, we have plenty of evidence. We have an interpretation of that evidence, and it may or may, it does fit with psychology pretty well in many instances, but it doesn't fit with all of psychology.
And welcome to yet another installment of Behind Greatness by Inspire. It's Luciano here as your host. Welcome back to our regular listener, and a welcome aboard to any new listener. Before we get started, we want to ask you, please rate, subscribe, and share with your family and friends. Those three things. There is a fourth thing. If you are so inclined, we all give our time to this. This is not, the podcast is not our business. We do not generate revenue. We do this for the fun of learning and learning from people who know things we don't, which is a lot of people. So we want to explore the what ifs and the why nots with people who are doing that naturally and every day. So if you want to give, be part of the team, you just go to our website. You find where you donate, and that process is very, very easy, very straightforward. So we are joined by Loyd Auerbach. He is a world-recognized paranormal expert and parapsychologist with 44 years of investigating the paranormal and over 40 years teaching courses in parapsychology. With thousands of media appearances, he's a director of the Office of Paranormal Investigations, president of the Forever Family Foundation, professor at Atlantic University, and adjunct professor, and president of the board of directors of the Rhine Research Center, where he teaches parapsychology online through their education center. He is the co-author of 9 books, including ESP Wars East and West, just something I also want to talk about with you. Psychic Dreaming, the classic ESP Hauntings and Poltergeists, a parapsychologist handbook. And he's also a co-author of paranormal mystery novels Near Death, A Rainy Day Investigation, and the second in the series, Afterlife. He is a professional mentalist and past president of the Psychic Entertainers Association, performing as Professor Paranormal, and also does his thing as an occasional chocolatier. And currently, is it current that you can see him in episodes of The Unexplained, Surviving Death on Netflix?
Yeah, they're running on Netflix and other places too.
Perfect. So welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I just noticed the Surviving Death thing on Netflix. Excuse me. We had Leslie Kane here, who's a journalist you know her well. Yeah. And she wrote the book upon which it's based.
There's a chapter in the book that I wrote on one of my apparition cases.
I didn't know that. So do share. What is the apparition case?
It was actually the case that I had that kind of made me go from middle of the road, I'm not sure if survival really happens or not, to this is the only explanation for this. It was a case I had here in the Bay Area back when we had our graduate parapsychology program, JFK University, in the 1980s. And it was after I and my department had gotten a huge amount of publicity because of Ghostbusters. So, we were pretty well known. I got a call from a woman who was a lawyer, family law attorney. And she had just discovered that her son had been communicating with a ghost every day since they moved into the house about a year and a half before. It was an older house here in the Bay Area, built in the early 20th century. And the previous owner, who did not die in the house, but she had been born in the house and had lived there all her life. So when they moved in, they individually, it was the woman, her husband, And her mother, who helped them move in, and the boy had all separately seen this female ghost, this woman, coming in down the stairs into the living room and then disappearing. The day that she called me, she'd had a little, I guess, interrogation with her son when he happened to mention that he'd been talking to this ghost for a year and a half, which they had not communicated with each other about. So as far as everybody in the family is concerned, nobody was talking about the ghost. No fear. This was a good thing. She just wanted to know if her 13-year-old son was going to grow up okay talking to a ghost every day. Was he was going to be a normal kid.
And she called you.
She called us at the department. Yeah. And ended up with me, partly, again, because of the publicity that we had gotten. First thing I had her do is take him to a recommended child psychologist, who was someone connected to the university, who I knew was not a believer in ghosts. He was not necessarily a disbeliever, but I wanted someone who could assess this, without thinking about, oh, really, this is a ghost kind of thing. And I met with him with permission of the family. And he basically said, look, I don't know if there's really a ghost there or not, but this is the best adjusted kid I've ever met. And he actually said that if all my clients had a ghost like this one, like Lois, that was the name of the ghost, I'd be out of business. That's what he said.
Right.
So when I went down there with actually my wife at the time, my ex-wife, but my wife at the time, and also this was actually between semesters at JFK. Mm-hmm. So most of our parapsychology students were not around. The receptionist was one of our consciousness students, consciousness and transpersonal psychology. So he came with me and we drove down to Livermore, which was about 40 minutes from the university. And during that time, we had a conversation so that, Kip could get to know my wife, and we talked about a bunch of things. We get to the house, we're met by the mother, the woman, her mother, the husband was out of town, and the boy, Chris. And Chris then turns to the side and says, and this is Lois. And of course, we didn't see anybody, mm-hmm. But we let Lois and Chris take us on a tour of the house where we were, and we had a recorder going from the moment we walked in the house, by the way, where we were told family stories that, as well as stuff about the history of Livermore, about the town, which I honestly did not count at all because he could have looked that up.
Sure.
So I had no idea if we're going to be able to verify these family stories. We end up sitting down in the living room in a semicircle around Chris and an empty easy chair, which is apparently where Lois was sitting, according to Chris. And asking more questions. And I was able to get information about Lois's only living relative. Later on, I was able to call him. He was in an assisted living facility nearby. And he not only verified some of these family stories, but I would start telling this family story and he would finish the story, which itself was pretty interesting. The mother, Pat, had gone through the house when they first moved in because it was fairly historic in the area. Didn't find any journals, didn't find anything like that. So there's nothing that Chris could have had of personal nature. But then we finished up by asking Lois questions about what's it like being a ghost? Why are you here? That kind of responses is what I wanted. And it was really interesting because here's a 13-year-old boy listening to apparently a spirit, and like a medium would, and then translating that, but giving responses that fit directly into what the models were that some of the early researchers came up with for what an apparition, what a ghost actually is. And her reason for sticking around was because she wasn't religious when she was alive and didn't know if there was a heaven or hell. So the response was, why take a chance? I just want to be home.
Wow.
So she ended up there. And then we finished up with me asking, were there any questions Lois wanted to ask us? Mm-hmm. And first one was a silly question because of Ghostbusters. But then it was, Loyd, what kind of new car do you want? Joanna, do you really want to quit your job at the law firm? And Kip, how long were you a professional dancer? And that all related directly to our conversation in the drive from the university down to Livermore. So unless my car was bugged, or this kid was incredibly psychic, I said, how does Lois know to ask us these questions? And the response was, well, she didn't trust you guys because of Ghostbusters. So she got to the university, got in your car and rode down and listened to your conversation. Well, I think something like that happens and you've checked out every other possibility.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we're down to, is it this kid who's incredibly psychic but demonstrates no other abilities? Or is it really that there's a ghost there? And again, the other folks had seen her as well.
We had on a podcast a few months ago, probably about 6 months ago, Father Nathan Castle, and he's a Dominican friar in Texas. Have you heard of him?
I have not.
Well, he is approached in his dreams by folks who have passed, but don't want to or can't or haven't figured out or are afraid to cross over. And so they appear to him for help. And he acts like a medium. He's not really permitted to use the word medium in his vocation.
Right.
So they call it prophecy. But in the spirit, the ghost, speaks through him as he surrounds himself with a prayer group to help counsel this spirit who's gone to the other side.
Yeah, it's really interesting. As you start looking at the folklore around ghosts, there are people who claim, and psychics and mediums and other folks who claim that every ghost is unaware that they're dead, that they're arguing, or they'll say that they're cursed just to roam the earth, or they're stuck in their house because that's where they died. And it actually runs the gamut of human psychology.
Mm.
What you hear from mediums, what you hear from the witnesses when they have communications, there are some folks, personally, I don't think that they don't know that they're dead. I think that they don't want to admit that they're dead. I mean, denial is the first thing that happens to people when they're given a terminal illness diagnosis.
Right.
So, that's a very human thing. The fear of what's next, very human thing. The not wanting to go, or because they're possessive of their home, or because they want to stick around for their family. I mean, there's so many possible reasons that we hear, and there's not a single thing you can say that fits one size fits all.
We'll put those all in the bucket. So fear, denial, physical assets, not wanting to leave the world because of all those three things. And then you threw in love of family or tie to family.
Yeah.
And in my forming opinion, malleable, but forming opinion, I believe that the link to family is, and I don't want to sound heartless here because I'm trying to figure things out as I go. So this discussion is part of figuring. The link to family is just as detrimental.
Yeah, it's detrimental for both sides. I mean, what we hear from some of the mediums that I work with through the Forever Family Foundation is that the spirit may be there to make sure the family's okay, and then the family's grieving or won't let go or work through their grief, so they're pretty much keeping the spirit there. That's a perspective from some of the mediums for some of these types of things. We also, you just mentioned that there's I think when talking about that friar that some of them don't know where to go, and the funniest thing that we sometimes hear from these folks, the spirit says, or she says, she didn't see the light, so she didn't know where to go. And that light, of course, comes from near-death experiences, although it's not consistent the world over, that tunnel and light. But it's pop culture for someone to say, who's apparently an apparition, they didn't see the light. It's like, well, maybe there isn't a light.
And maybe there isn't a light for some versus others.
Right.
I mean, we've listened to a lot of near-death experiences on the show, but also personally. And there are a lot of stories, near-death experiences, where the person, once they've left their body, find themselves in a dark abyss. Not necessarily fearful of the dark, but in quiet loneliness. And I could understand where that's scary, but maybe that's natural.
I did some work with Japanese television for a few years back in the early 90s. And when we did a show on near-death experiences, and I got to talk to folks in Japan who had near-death experiences, and their experience was not a tunnel of light. It was a bridge over a stream and a beautiful flower garden where one of their ancestors was waiting for them. Also, this attachment to family for these shows, we worked with a Japanese medium named Aiko Gibo. And the very first show, the producers wanted we brought her into a lab, did some testing with her, but they also wanted to go to a haunted place that I had investigated, or just some place that we could take her to see how she did, because they're here in the United States. And of course, there are supposedly all these haunted places around. And when I started talking to her about that, she got very nervous. And I said, what's the deal with, you speak to spirits all the time. What's the problem with going to a haunted place? And she said, in Japan, and this is partly because of she was Shinto. This is partly of her belief.
Mm-hmm.
In Japan, the only places that have spirits are spirits that are either depressed or have no family to connect. And I said, well, that's exactly the opposite in the US. Most people don't want to stick around with their family after death. They want to move on. Most people, I think, may not want to stick around their family a lot of the times. So
lots of learning you've had for the last 40 years.
Yeah. Culturally, cross-culturally, there are different expressions. And part of this is we don't know sometimes if this is like, is it a rule in Asia? Because I've also talked to Chinese people who've had that same type of bridge and stream or river and garden. Is that something to do with, the environment? Is that something to do with their upbringing, culture, psychology? Or is that a reporting artifact? Are they only telling us their experiences if they fit the cultural accepted norm for that kind of experience?
I have a belief that beliefs are what form what you see and feel. And so you take that with you when you leave your body.
Exactly. I would agree with that completely. And we do see belief as the major correlating factor to psychic experience in general, psychic abilities.
So you tell me your experience here, but I've been, again, forming this opinion, and this podcast has helped us do this as well, that everybody has this capability, and we are starting to believe that it's a natural capability, but those who have had it more pronounced in their lives we find, and I find, let's say are of a more open belief, have a more open belief structure.
Yeah, it depends. Sometimes there is a trauma that kind of induces or brings out the ability. But once they have that experience, belief in the ability that the ability is real reinforces that. The laboratory evidence shows that if people who are, because everybody does have some degree of ESP and possibly psychokinesis ability. It's an aptitude thing, though. To some extent, it's like with artistic ability. People have an aptitude for certain types of art or music or other things. So it's almost not an ability. It's almost a talent that folks can bring out. But in the laboratory, we see that people who believe in ESP, and especially if they believe they can do well in the experiment, they tend to score above chance, often significantly. But interestingly enough, people who just disbelieve that this is even real or potentially real will sometimes score significantly below chance.
Roger Nelson, who by the time Roger Nelson from
I know Roger,
Pair.
yeah.
Okay. We had him on the podcast. So by the time this airs, his episode would have aired. And he introduced himself to the Pair Lab before he was hired as somebody who's 100% skeptical and 100% open.
Well, being skeptical, the true definition of a skeptic is someone who may not have made up their mind.
Right. Like I would say a true scientist.
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah. The problem is that the skeptical movement has been kind of like taken over by what Marcello Truzzi, who was one of the founders of Psychop, of the original skeptical group. He only stayed with them for about a year because he found out that they had an agenda, but he called them pseudo-skeptics, that they pretend to be skeptical and open-minded, but they're clearly not skeptical and open-minded.
So one thing is, in the early 80s, you gained some fame, so to speak, because Ghostbusters had come out at that time, at 83, 84. And you were seen as a kind of a real life Ghostbuster or ghost hunter.
Right.
So you had a lot of media exposure for that decade. that right?
Yeah, it was kind of a really interesting fluke because, Ghostbusters came out at the end of May of 1984. We actually, the department, the parapsychology, we were the only graduate program, actually the only parapsychology program at any accredited university in the United States at the time. And we did some local TV and a couple of newspaper articles. And then someone from the Oakland Tribune called wanting to do a profile of the faculty, because we did do investigations, although that was certainly not the only thing we did outside of teaching. But unfortunately for everybody else, or fortunately for me, timing wise, I was the only one in town during the process, because everyone else went to the Parapsychological Association convention in Dallas, Texas. I could not afford to go. So I was left kind of holding down the fort. And so the piece ended up running the very beginning of September, and it was a 2-page spread with a big photo of me on the front page of the lifestyle section of the Oakland Trib. And then it got picked up by the Associated Press because Ghostbusters was still in the theaters months later. I mean, think about that, given what we have today, right?
With it was huge. It was huge.
Yeah, it was huge. It stayed through October, in fact, in many theaters. And so the Associated Press picked it up, and all of a sudden, I and the department got deluged with requests for further interviews. I think in October, I did over 250 radio interviews. Some of them were only 5 minutes, but then there were many, many more that everybody else in the faculty ended up doing. Because we were the real life Ghostbusters at a real life university.
You were doing this field work for the love of field work. You mentioned to me last time we chatted, excuse me, that you don't have an affinity to lab work. You want to be out in the field, which means that you're exposed to a lot of people going through different experiences. So I want to go through some of those, like the poltergeist experiences, ghost haunting experiences. We've already discussed a few of those. Without asking you stories, and it's up to you. Actually, no. Why don't we back up? Why don't I ask you a story? Because I meant to ask you this at the beginning. The story about you at the bachelor party, something that kind of kicked things off for you?
Well, yeah. So my first job out of graduate school was working at the American Society for Psychical Research, which sadly doesn't exist anymore, in New York City. We had, I was in the education department. I was kind of the media liaison, as well as kind of doing outreach for education in other ways. And our research was actually with a man by the name of Alex Tanis, who was a psychic and medium. He was doing out-of-body experience research. Dr. Carlos Osis and Donna McCormick were the researchers. We had a very clear, controlled setup, and Alex could do a number of other things as well. I got to know Alex. I spent a lot of time with Alex. He came down from Maine, where he lived, every other week to do research and occasionally to consult with law enforcement as well. And I started talking to him about, how do I become more psychic? How does this happen for me? And he gave me some advice, some basic advice, which I pass on to people over the time. But then he said to me, I can sense, Loyd, that you are, and this is, of course, a paraphrase, you're going to have some experiences. You may not know when they're going to happen, but you're going to have a lot of experiences to keep you in the field, to keep you interested. So it wasn't too long after that I woke up in the morning from a dream. I had been teaching adult ed courses. I got to know a number of my students. I had a couple psychics in my class. And I woke up from this dream, which seemed really very, very real, that I had in the middle of the night visited one of my students and her daughter. Daughter was 18. They were late night people, and their dog. And I didn't think anything of it. I just thought it was a dream. But a couple of days later, I got a call from her saying, were you ever going to call me? It's like, you showed up here in the middle of the night. You were clearly asleep at the time because you told us you were. So apparently I had an out-of-body experience where I traveled to their house about 50 miles away and showed up. She and her daughter and the dog reacted to me, had a conversation, and then they sent me home, more or less. A couple weeks later.
They had a conversation with an apparition of you?
Correct. So one of the categories of apparitions we have is apparitions of the living, which are sometimes related to people going out of body and being perceived by the people who we visit when you're out of your body. So a couple of weeks later, I was at a bachelor party, and it was at the point we had gone out to dinner, and we're back at my friend's apartment, and we were, frankly, they were, doing porn films, and I was getting a little bored with hanging around with a bunch of guys doing that. So I was in the kitchen pouring myself a drink, and I had this really weird sensation. And all I can say is it felt like I was split, because part of me recognized I'm still in the kitchen, but I also had this sensation and mental image of myself standing in my friend, the same psychic's living room. And she looks up from reading a book, and we start talking. And at the very end of this short conversation, I said, "You've got to write this down. We need to compare notes." And she said, "You need to do that also." So I felt like a snap. I felt like I snapped back. I scrambled around the kitchen, my friend's kitchen, for something to write down with. I wrote down some notes. And then I called her the next morning when I got to work at the ASPR. And the first thing out of her mouth was, "Did you take notes?" So we compared notes, and that was it. But those are the only two out of body experiences I've ever had.
Well, I mean, those are pretty profound. So
when you say pretty profound, they were incredibly profound for me. When I told Alex Dennis about them, he just kind of laughed and said, "I told you."
So how profound were they? How did they change you at all, and how?
They were profound from an intellectual perspective. It was confirmation for me. There certainly was an emotional content to that as well. But, I had already believed in this. I had gotten into this field not because of experiences, but because, for a couple of reasons. One of which was it was a science, and I was really interested in science. And the evidence just seemed to me to be obvious that there were these abilities that people actually had. I still wasn't quite sure about the ghost thing at that point, but there was very obvious from the research that I read that there's something really to this. And I got to, as a teenager, talk to a couple of parapsychologists in the New York area as well. So I had not had really any experiences, but even when I was in grad school, I had a couple of really interesting things happen to me when I was doing investigations as part of the student work. But they were just kind of, just said, well, maybe they were psychic, maybe they weren't. This was profound in the sense that, okay, you've had a real psychic experience. By the way, in my teenage years, because this was during the 70s, I really tried to have an out-of-body experience. I mean, I was reading all the books, never could have anything happen to me like that.
So let's go back to when you were at your friend's house and you split. When you split, you were conscious of being that somewhere else. Your physical body, how did you perceive that when you were split somewhere else?
I was still aware of my body standing and leaning against the wall in the kitchen.
Was that body thinking? Was that body connected to the thought or to a feeling, or was it a shell?
It seemed like it was. It seemed like it was. And in talking to Alex about this experience afterwards, because Alex had developed over the course of his life the ability to narrate what his out-of-body presence was actually doing. Because the whole experiment was he would go out, he would first try to move to affect some strain gauges we had set up in a separate room away from the isolation room. And then and those strain gauges were connected to a chart recorder. And then he would go to a target system where it was actually an optical system that combined a bunch of different things for him to look at. And then again, he'd have to say what Alex, too, his out-of-body presence was saying. So when we talked about this, he said, it's almost like you and your body are the station, and you're sending out a drone or space probe. He talked about it as a probe, a split. He never felt that his spirit left his body. That's one thing he was very clear about. In fact, at one point he said, if my spirit left my body, I'd be dead. So he felt it was part of his consciousness that split off. So he was aware of both places. And I've talked to other people who said the same thing.
If spirit left his body, he'd be dead. That is very interesting because folks would just conflate the two, right? Spirit and whatever it is, your conscious. So we also had a very interesting fellow here from South Africa. Was introduced to us by John Alexander, Colonel John Alexander, who's also on the podcast. Werner Barkusin, and funny. He had his first out of body experience sitting down with the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi. So as soon as he told me that the first time, I thought, okay, that's street cred. It's Mahatma Gandhi's grandson. So sure, of course, we're gonna hear about a mystical spiritual experience, which is really judgy and really snooty, because he's just another human being who can teach and who has these experiences, as Werner is, as you are, as I am, just like anybody else. Do you find that snootiness like you had 40 years ago? I asked that because you also quoted, let me just add something else there. Still keep in mind that question. As you said, especially with academics, there's an atmosphere, quote unquote, atmosphere of dismissal, especially in the physical sciences, not in quantum physics, but in the physical sciences. In your full-time job at Nexus, you mentioned your coworkers who were lawyers, librarians, researchers would always take you aside and share with you their experiences.
Yeah. So,
remember my question from 5 minutes ago.
Snootiness thing. Yeah. I don't know if snootiness is the right word. In the academic world here in the US, and it's changed. I mean, it's certainly changed since the 1970s. And we pretty much point at the skeptical organizations and their mission.
Yeah.
To make it like this. It's more than dismissal. And actually it's not, there are folks in the physical sciences, but they dismiss parapsychology for a separate reason than psychologists do. My experience with physicists and some of the other physical scientists, because I've met a whole lot over the years, is that social science is not real science. It's not just parapsychology, it's psychology, sociology. In fact, I had a conversation with a physicist and he said, parapsychology is not a science. And I asked him, is psychology a science? And he looked at me and he said, no, it's not a science. So when you have that attitude, I kind of respect that in that sense. I mean, I understand where they're coming from. Psychologists, Dean Radin did years ago, he did a survey of people in all sciences, and it was psychologists who were the least accepting of the possibility of ESP or any of this.
How do you like them apples? Huh?
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's face it, what we're talking about may actually influence, affect the nature of psychology itself.
100%. Turn it on its head.
A lot more. Yeah, it would. A lot more than it would physics, for that matter. There's this attitude that it is dismissal, but even amongst the scientists, I know Dean has talked about this. I've had these experiences where people will, in a group, academics will say this stuff doesn't exist, it's not real. They'll even be very dismissive and even insulting sometimes, and then pull you aside. By the way, I got to tell you my ghost story.
100%.
I got to tell you what happened psychically. They never told anybody. So what you're alluding to earlier, I work for LexisNexis. That is my day job. And over the years, I have met many, many people in the legal community, because that's the main community I work with these days. Of extremely large law firms, but I've also met people in the business community, especially in my commuting over the years back and forth to San Francisco. And once they know, who I am, what I do, they will tell me their stories, and they're not shy about telling me, but they generally have not told anybody else because I've asked them that. Well, here's the funny thing. Years ago, there was a large law firm in San Francisco that was in a historic building in San Francisco. They've since moved into their own building. And some of the lawyers and other folks staying after hours were experiencing stuff in this building. It had been a Federal Reserve building in the past in San Francisco. So the head librarian said, hey, you want to come over and do an investigation, and then we can have a luncheon and you can tell everybody what you found. We'll video record, and maybe, the manager, people might want to actually talk about this outside the firm because it's kind of a cool thing in this building. And so I did find out, I talked to security people and maintenance. When I do a public location, security and maintenance are the ones you always want to talk to first. because they're going to have a straight talk on what's really going on. But then
Real research in the field.
Yeah. Then I would talk to some of the people who had experiences, the receptionists and everybody. We sit down for the talk. I show some video of walking around with these maintenance guys. Everybody was really excited about it. And the librarian thinks, okay, this is great PR for the firm. So she talks to the marketing people. They think it's great PR for the firm. Then it turns out one of the managing partners says, nope, we can't tell anybody about this. Why not? Because we could get sued by some of our employees may decide this is a hostile work environment. And we may end up having a lawsuit by announcing the place is haunted to the rest of the world.
Fair. That's fair.
Lawyers.
Yeah. That's fair, because of course they're paid to think that way, right?
Right.
Of course.
None of us thought about that because everybody who was coming to the lunch was, of course, everybody in the firm.
Yeah.
They were all very excited to hear it. And it was nothing negative at all.
I read some of your cases and some of the ones that you reported as well in some articles. I'm sure you've seen some really weird stuff. Are there dangers, are there risks of doing this field work and quote unquote, and for real, hunting ghosts?
So I interestingly enough, I get asked this question a lot is, and the variation of that is, have you ever been afraid of anything in the paranormal? And I'll be very honest that there's two things here. First, I am not fearful or worried about anything ghostly, psychic, or any of that. I'm just not. A lot of ghost hunters talk about having to do protection prayers and all this stuff, and I don't. I kiddingly say I'm a Jedi. Unless there's a Sith Lord that shows up, I'm not worried about it.
And what happens if there is a Sith Lord?
Well, so far I haven't had to worry about that.
No. I mean, that's pretty frightening.
Yeah. If there really is, we got to find some real Jedi. That's all I can say.
Well, you know what? We're going to have an exorcist on the podcast this fall, and that's very good. You said Sith Lord. Maybe he can help us with that too. Sorry,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So the dangers are twofold. There's a psychological potential danger when doing investigations. If you are going into a place that had some terrible things happen to it, we separate the idea of apparitions or ghosts, the idea of conscious entities, from imprints in the environment, which are called residual hauntings or just plain hauntings. And human beings leave emotion and impression behind all the time. And human beings pick it up. I mean, you go house hunting or apartment hunting, you walk into a place, it feels good, it feels bad. That's a form of haunting. The emotions of the people are kind of imprinted in the area, and we're sensitive to that.
So, I mean, I would argue that every single human being on the planet has a feeling when they walk into a room.
Yeah. That's a psychic experience, unless of course it's the decor or the smell, but it is normally a psychic experience. And so there can be places, and I've been in places where incredible amount of despair or violence happened. And you feel that. And if you feel that, that can affect you psychologically, and if you're not prepared for it. So that's a danger in one respect. The other danger, honestly, is with the structure itself. Is it a safe environment to go to? More importantly, are the people who live in that place, are they safe to be around? And I've had a few instances where I can't say I was afraid for my life, but it was pretty close because of the family dynamics or the domestic stuff that was going on that really had nothing to do with the paranormal. In fact, there was nothing paranormal at all going on.
That reminds me of a conversation we had with Jeffrey Kreipel here about poltergeists. He gave the example of a teenage girl. And
that's a stereotype. Yeah,
right. Yeah, of course. And we also had Lynn Buchanan here on very recently. And Lynn Buchanan obviously was he was a remote viewer in a Black Ops program for the Army. And he explained to us that he was a poltergeist kid, and he had a poltergeist moment as an officer. Was he an officer? No, he was a sergeant at the time, I think, in the Army, where the general figured out what his ability was and then recruited him into the classified program. You've done a lot of work with poltergeists. what number one, give us actually, number two, give us an example. Number one, what is a poltergeist, or what is meant by that?
Sure. And there's a slight difference in how this word is used
Yeah.
by parapsychologists in the US and the UK. I will just start out by saying that.
Okay.
But poltergeist phenomena is physical phenomena, purely physical phenomena, meaning that there's not typically an indication there's a ghost, an apparition present that's responsible for it. It centers around a living person. And our model of this is it's an unconscious form of psychokinesis, which is mind over matter, that is reacting to some psychological stress or stress in general for the individual. We call them a poltergeist agent or epicenter. There's about 30% of the poltergeist agents who are actually have neurological issues, like a form of epilepsy or epileptic-like activity that is causing the activity, the physical activity, but it's purely physical activity that's there. In the UK, they'll use the term poltergeist if there's physical activity, whether there's a ghost there or not, and then they'll split it out to living agent versus discarnate or apparition type thing. We just start out in the US with this is a living agent situation. Not to say that there aren't ghost cases where stuff moves, but it's never chaos like we see in poltergeist cases.
The belief or the driver in the approach to a poltergeist situation in your case in the US is that the person who is responsible for moving objects without touching them in a room is doing this telekinetically.
Yeah, it's unconscious, and it's, if you want to tell it, we use psychokinesis as kind of a catch-all because
psychokinetically
more it really fits better because it means movement by the mind or action by the mind. It can be also electronic. We have one of my colleagues, John Kruth, had a real specific case of electrical activity, electronic activity, things going haywire. And there's been research in the field in parapsychology in the lab on human-machine interactions, how our moods, how our stresses, our frustrations affect electronics around us as well.
Sorry, I just wanted to add, we've understood that there are many NDE experiencers who have come back from the experience and can't be around electronics. They shut things down.
That's probably not, something they're giving off other than, something about their unconscious connecting or not connecting properly. So when we do poltergeist investigations, we try to figure, it's a mystery. I mean, to me, it's like a whodunit, which is really kind of cool. It's one of the things that got me into the field is this is a mystery. There's still a lot of mystery around our experiences and what causes them. So for poltergeist activity, we look for, the teenage girl thing is a stereotype because I think mainly because of Carrie of Stephen King's book and movie, original one.
Yeah.
I've had poltergeist agents into their 70s. I had one who was a woman who was 80 years old, who was a poltergeist agent. My first case was actually a poltergeist case with a 16-year-old girl. So of course we immediately thought it was her, but it actually turned out to be her mom, was a poltergeist agent.
And how did you figure that out?
Well, one of the things we have to do is look at what the activity represents. So what's moving, what's happening, who's around, because the typical poltergeist case, the agent has to be pretty much in the location. There've been a couple of very, very rare experiences where the kid was at school or something else, but they're in the location. And then if you have various family members, if the one person's there and no one else is there, then you have to pin it on that. But then you can look at the different combinations. So who's the common denominator for that? And that's how we figured that one out in general. The other thing is really look at the psychology. The original idea for living agent activity, psychokinesis, comes from a man by the name of Nandor Fodor. I know there's a movie out right now called Nandor Fodor and the Talking Mongoose, which Fodor was a Hungarian expat. He was a lawyer in Hungary. He actually went back to school, became a psychoanalyst, actually wrote a lot of material on psychoanalysis. He worked in the UK and then also in the US, but he was also a parapsychologist. And he approached poltergeist cases specifically from a psychoanalytic approach. And he came up with this idea that there is a living person at the center of these specific types of cases. And William G. Roll, in the late 1950s, with a very famous case in Long Island, he developed this idea further, and we call it recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. It's the unconscious that's doing it, that's kind of lashing out. And it's chaotic.
Yeah, but I think that's what's fun, the chaos, because if you step back from it, we're not just our bodies.
No.
I mean, this
right.
is what you've been discovering. This is what we've been discovering on this podcast. And that's pretty damn exciting, because if it's not our five senses, our traditional five senses that are driving something, then what the hell is? And why is it that we don't have the answer? Like, what is it that's driving the fact that we don't have the answer?
Well, one of the biggest questions in science, and we're talking about across the board, is what is consciousness?
Sure.
And there's all sorts of different approaches, from the purely materialistic to the purely spiritual. Nobody knows. And I'm just reminded of the fact, I think it was Ambrose Bierce, who was a fiction writer, wrote a great humorous book called The Devil's Dictionary. And the idea of the mind is the only thing that studies itself. The mind studies everything else, but, we're trying to study ourselves, which makes it really difficult. I always have to point out the fact that people talk about, goes back to whether psychology is a science. It's a social science. There are completely different ideas and models of the mind in psychology that are often in conflict with one another. And there are those kinds of conflicts in physics as well. So when people say to me, well, you have no evidence, it's like, we have plenty of evidence. We have an interpretation of that evidence. And it does fit with psychology pretty well in many instances, but it doesn't fit with all of psychology.
But evidence is also defined by biases and beliefs on what you think good evidence is.
And the amount of evidence, right? That's right. Yeah. And there's a point where it is belief and bias that can actually even accept the evidence, even within parapsychology, the evidence for survival of bodily death, whether it's apparition, some of the reincarnation cases with kids who remember previous lives, whether it's mediumship. Within parapsychology, there are those who don't accept any of that as evidence for survival of consciousness. They look at it as evidence for a form of ESP that is perhaps bigger or better than the average form of ESP that people deal with. And that's partly because they're approaching this from a purely materialist perspective.
I assume that you're not a materialist?
No, I am not.
So what do you believe after bodily death? What do you believe in after bodily death?
I mean, and possibly I have to say that my belief has also been shaped by where I came into this field, which is from science fiction and comic books. So I'm going to freely admit that. It's really interesting. Science fiction has done a lot more exploration of the ideas of psychic phenomena in better ways than pretty much anything, even within our field.
Yeah, it's guarded itself.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. It's true. So I do believe that consciousness, I don't know that consciousness, people talk about consciousness coming into the body. I think that the brain develops consciousness. Maybe that consciousness itself is, in general, there are those reincarnation cases, but I'm still not sure what that means. But I think consciousness is created by our experience, the brain, by our experience here, but that it can exist on its own. It certainly does have non-local properties that can pull information. Mm-hmm. So the idea is, can that thing that we call us, can that exist as a coherent something after death? And I think that to my way of thinking, and from looking at the evidence, the answer to that is yes. I don't know what's next. People always ask me, what's the afterlife like? And my response, again, comes from science fiction. It's something we can't even express in normal human terms, because you're without a body. I mean, how do you even describe that? There are a couple science fiction novels that actually try to. in a completely different way, but they're approaching it from a science fiction perspective.
That's why I like to ask, why are we in bodies to begin with? Because it seems like this is a shell. It seems like it's a container that had it serves a function. It has been servicing a function for us for tens of thousands of years.
Right.
But why is it that we have a body, and why is it that we can't have a definitive answer of what happens after the body? So what is it that's driving us to have these implanted doubts?
Well, because we have only a physical, material way of dealing with the universe in general. It's our experience. We're restricted by our interface device. The interface. We are the interface device. Our bodies are the interface. So regardless of whether, the brain generates consciousness or consciousness is, there's this whole idea that consciousness is out there and we're like little spikes of information. We're like this laptop that I'm looking at right now, connected to the internet. I always talk to people about, there are people in the new age world that talk about the Akashic records, the place where all the information is.
Yep.
I said, well, you mean the cloud? You can talk about that. You can really talk about this in terms of IT terms very easily.
Great metaphor.
Yeah. I mean, we download information from the cloud.
Yeah. So if we are the interface, if we are to believe that we are an interface, we have to let go completely of the ego in order to see if we can feel, probably not think, but feel what is true.
That's probably a good way of putting it. Yeah. Yeah.
Unlike our indigenous brethren, I think we've lost the ability to feel that because we've been indoctrinated so very long into thinking through things.
Well, and there's the whole development of materialist thought, of rational empiricism, which is important.
Sure. Because
we have a physical world we're dealing with. It limits us. I mean, basically the paradigm is limiting. It's not expansive enough.
Stephen Schwartz says it.
Yeah, you're right about the indigenous people. I got fascinated with Australian Aboriginal mythology and beliefs before I even got into anthropology in college. And it's really, they have a really interesting perspective, and there's some really interesting stories that have come out, from that world, because it's the longest running culture. I always kind of laugh sometimes when I hear about cave paintings that are the oldest thing found is 12,000 years old. And I think, well, some of the rock paintings in Australia have been dated to 40,000 years ago.
Yeah, the 12,000-year-old paintings are the ones in France. Is that right?
France, yeah. And there were some more recent ones that were discovered that were older than that. But still, I don't think they're as old as what's the rock paintings.
Sure.
In Australia.
We had a wonderful guy, Tyson Yucaporta, who's an indigenous philosopher, an academic in Northern Australia. We talked a little bit about the sky people and the earth people. And back then, early on in the podcast, I think it was episode 30 or something like that, we were less equipped to ask the questions that we like to ask now. But fascinating. And we want to have more indigenous elders here. And I say that I know it's with the times, but I grew up. Sorry, I don't want to go off topic too, but maybe it isn't off topic. My grandparents came here after the war. They're from southern Italy, and in southern Italy, as is now, yes, it's very Catholic, but it's also very ancient, and superstition and other beliefs that folks poo-poo have been there much longer than Catholicism, and that they brought over. And so I learned kind of by osmosis the importance of that ancient wisdom. But I grew up in the West, in the new Western world, where all that stuff has been compacted and shut away. So it's the indigenous folks today are the ones that are, for me, they're the window to that old world that we all used to be part of. There's nothing new there. It's the same old, but it's the old that we've been ignoring. Anyway, that's
yeah. Yeah. And of course, we have to think also about the fact that a lot of our ancestors, and even going back in time at all, there's misinterpretation because people didn't have the basic knowledge to actually understand what was going on with nature, for example. That's why I'm constantly battling with that word poltergeist, because it means noisy ghost. It's not a ghost.
Yeah.
That's
Well, we need to categorize here. That's the problem.
Yeah, and the term was coined, at least we had a couple of historians years ago, one of our Parapsychological Association conventions, who had tracked back that word's origin to at least the 16th century in Germany.
Oh, wow.
And there could not, how could they possibly even conceived of the idea that a living person was responsible for that without calling that person a witch and burning them,
which
at
was
the stake?
dangerous at the time. Yeah, of course.
Right.
Of course.
So, that's the thing, is that the interpretation, and even today, I've run into people who think that what I'm doing is, the will of Satan or something like that because of religion or old beliefs.
Well, you mentioned the 1600s and witch hunts. The 1600s really, if you take a perspective here, that's still recent times. That's still modern human history. Like in the 1600s, they were afraid of institutions burning them at the stake or putting them in jail because of what they wanted to discover and possibly believe. That's not indigenous.
No, that's not indigenous. And religion carries with it a lot of superstition too. Of
course,
so any religion does. And the idea that we don't evolve, we don't develop, we don't have a better understanding of the world. This is causing a lot of problems because people are interpreting stuff that's 4,000 years old sometimes as basically fact. When we have other explanations for those things, you can't levy the same kind of rules in society that were written down 4,000 years ago in a completely different culture. Otherwise, and there's some cultures that still have those beliefs.
Healthy skepticism and openness. This is why it's key. Have that balance. One thing I forgot to ask you at the beginning, I should have, but we're here now. We have been learning, especially in the last 6 months or so on podcasts, of various institutions, organizations, associations, especially in the States, that revolve around the study of what we've been talking about, including the Pear Institute with Roger Nelson, the Free Foundation with Ray Hernandez, Rhine Institute. Tell us more about this. What is this about?
Right. So it's the Rhine Research Center.
Sorry.
And it is the legacy. It's the legacy of the old Duke Parapsychology Lab that was created at Duke University by J.B. Rhine, William McDougall, and Louisa Rhine back in the mid-1930s. Rhine, this is what was the center. Duke University was the center of ESP and PK research for many, many years. In the 50s, I think, another organization, the Psychical Research Foundation, which focused more on survival research, also started in the North Carolina area, and that still exists in a much smaller fashion. But Rhine retired from Duke University, a mandatory retirement from what I understand, in 1965. And he took the lab off campus, started a foundation, which included the Institute for Parapsychology. And then a couple of years after his death in the 1980s, it was renamed the Rhine Research Center. So it is actually the longest running laboratory in parapsychology in the United States at this point. The Rhine Center does do some research. It's doing some bioenergy, biophoton research, and a couple of other different research projects, but also has an education center, which is where I teach. Myself and John Kruth, who's the executive director, we do most of the teaching. And our classes are semi-academic, I have to say, in the sense that we do have students who go through for a grade and towards a certificate. It's not a college per se. I have a lot of students take stuff for fun, but we also have other programs. The Rhine Center has weekly research meetings, which are done by Zoom. Has also monthly lectures. In fact, I did one last month on poltergeists. Usually they're Friday evenings or Friday afternoons, depending on part of the country. So we do quite a bit of outreach to the public, occasional sponsor workshops and things. Since the pandemic, everything's been pretty much online. Although I'm going to be there in Durham, North Carolina in November, and I'll do a workshop that's both for people who want to be there in person. It'll be a small group, and then we'll do it online as well. So that's it's a full nonprofit and really does quite a lot of good work with outreach.
I told you before the recording that my my older boy is attending university, and he decided to take a course for fun, so breath requirement, and he's studying the sciences. He's in the sciences, steeped in it, on the paranormal, which is offered through the Faculty of Religion at his university. And he showed me that there's a registration list of about 200 plus students.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of interesting that I think universities have missed the boat, at least with electives on the subject. Because if they had an elective course taught by somebody who knew what they're talking about, especially, there are actually a couple of universities in the US that teach classes by skeptics. And I've actually run into students when I used to do college lectures. I've run into students that told me that they didn't, their professor didn't tell them about all the research that was out there. He was just simply advertising his belief. Yeah.
Yeah. What a shame.
There's so many people interested in this subject that universities are possibly missing the boat in terms of offering things. I remember when I was at Northwestern in my college days, the opening lecture for freshman week was by J. Allen Hynek, was the head of the astronomy department. Hynek was the guy for UFOs at the time, besides Jacques Vallée. And not only did every freshman attend that lecture, you didn't have to, but it was packed. I mean, the lecture hall was standing room only every time he did a lecture on UFOs. So
if people are curious about it, why poo-poo it? Why shut it down? You ask the reason for the curiosity.
Right.
Explore it. Like what? I mean, you're an educational institution. That's your job, is to explore.
Right. And, I've run into some things over the years. One thing I ran into when I was working at the ASBR was teaching adult ed classes. And one of the ones I was proposing was for Westchester Community College back then. And the head of the social science department, apparently for adult ed, the appropriate department had to approve the course as well for that particular college. And the head of the department, social sciences, he thought it was a great idea. He thought, a lot of students want to take it. He thought it was great, right? He said, here's the problem. We're going to have a meeting this week. You're going to have to talk about the course, convince the faculty that are there. We're going to vote on whether or not the course can run. There are going to be two professors who are going to be absolutely against your course. And I said, they're skeptics. They don't believe this. He said, I have no idea, but they're history professors. Their own courses are under attended. And what will happen is if students in adult ed if our students hear about your course, they're going to demand that we teach it for credit, and we'll have to drop one of their courses.
It's such a boring thing that human beings do.
I know. Well, it comes down to, I've talked to folks at various universities. There is a budgetary consideration for starting, let's say, new classes. That's one part of it. This is beyond the bias that's there. There are budgetary considerations at universities. My dad was a sports producer. He actually produced the international broadcast of the Rose Bowl and the Tournament of Roses parade. And at one point, he had a retreat for the coaches of the Pac-10 colleges. And of course, the Pac-10's in big trouble now. The Pac-12 is in big trouble right now. But the specific conference coaches, I was there. I mean, I went to the retreat because it was local here in the Bay Area, not far from the Bay Area. And I got to talk to these coaches. What would it take for your university to have a parapsychology program? And every single one of them, these are like major universities, state and otherwise, said, you got to find some funding. So first you get a donor or someone who's going to bring in a couple $1 million. 50% of that needs to be designated for the football team or for athletic programs. And I said, why that? He said, because then we will support the heck out of you and you'll never lose your program.
Again, that's
money. Yeah.
Yeah. It's boring. You know what? It's boring because it's so 3D rooted.
Yeah.
You can't escape it. You can't escape it.
Well, it's coming at, when we talk about education in this area or bring these things, it comes from a lot of different places. There is the true disbeliever. There are the religious folks who are opposed to some of this. Although,
Sure.
as you mentioned, the religion department at that college is offering this course. I know that there have been a number of universities, St. John's University in Pennsylvania.
Mhm.
There was someone, in fact, they had a parapsychology course running for many years until he retired. And it's coming, by someone in the Catholic Church, mind you. And it was a really great course. There have been places that Jesuit colleges have offered stuff from time
Yeah.
to time.
Oh, we're
Because they,
learning something about the Jesuits. Sorry, Loyd.
yeah,
Through Denny Sheehan, who's going to be on the podcast as well, and
good. That's good.
contemplative nature of the Jesuits. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Vatican and what he learned about what the Vatican is wishing to do. Anyway, that's
Okay,
just a
no,
small
that's
teaser.
good. Yeah, they were my heroes when ABC back in the '80s tried showing a live exorcism on TV, and the Jesuits were kind of poo-pooing the whole thing that was going on. So,
Can I look that up? Is that YouTubeable?
possibly, yeah. I don't know if it's on YouTube or not. I'll get you the reference to that.
Yeah. Thank you.
I wrote it up actually in my first book as it happened. It was pretty interesting. That and it was, I think it was 1983 was when it was 2020 did a segment that they had taped and filmed and showed the whole exorcism with the teenage girl and the whole bit. And the thing is that they were claiming, this is something I've heard many times, the person has to be held down because otherwise they'll levitate and all sorts of things will happen. And the most interesting reaction, because I was working at the ASPR at the time, was from a couple of reporters who called me and said, "What do you think about this thing?" And they said, "If I was there, I would have thrown a body tackle at the priest holding down the girl, because if she floated, it would have been proof that something was really happening."
Right.
And then the Jesuits had been on Nightline. That you might be able to find the Nightline transcript from that. They were the ones who actually talked about how there was no indication that they could tell that there was anything demonic going on, that there was more psychological. And they were very critical of the whole process, in fact.
Well, it was. I was also watching on the plane recently the movie The Pope's Exorcist, Father Amort, who was quoted, and he's not the only one. We actually looked into this very recently about exorcists in the U.S. across the U.S. They all say similar things about the percentage of people who are actually possessed. That it's a very small percentage of people.
Yeah, I just met somebody who's with the church not too long ago at a little paranormal conference here in the Bay Area, and same thing. And Keith Johnson, who's doing a lot of that work, said the same thing. He said, he's run into 2 or 3 cases over the years, that he felt might have been demonic. So but there are unfortunately a lot of people out there who are claiming to be demonologists and exorcists, and there's deliverance ceremonies. And the biggest problem is that kids have died. People have died in these ceremonies, not by the official people with the Catholic Church, because they're a lot more careful. Kids have died. We have a case, I don't know if it's still going on in San Jose here in the Bay Area, where the parents, I think, are up for, I don't know if it's manslaughter or for something else, because their 2-year-old, who they thought was possessed because she was, from all the descriptions, it's like I've seen toddlers who do exactly what this kid was doing. They said she was possessed, and they got someone in to do an exorcism, and the child died.
Oh boy. Well, I mean, I don't want to leave it on that note.
No.
But that is a human fact. And this is all of this is tied to. I don't want to oversimplify it. This is not my intention. All of this is tied to belief system. All of it.
Yeah. I mean, we try to be as clear. We're always looking for alternative explanations for every bit of what we're studying. And honestly, when I do investigations, that's the first thing I always do. In fact, I try to do that even on the phone when I'm talking to someone. And I've always found, I mean, I can think of 1 or 2 cases, but I can say that almost without exclusion, even in the best of the cases that we have where we think something apparitional or haunting or poltergeist phenomena is going on, there's some stuff that absolutely is not. It's misinterpreted. It's partly because people are on edge because of the experience. There were a couple of real estate company surveys that were done during the pandemic, during the lockdowns, where apparently the belief that people had that their house was haunted skyrocketed heavily. And I put that to the fact that based on what was reported, people were in their homes and locked in their homes for 24 hours a day. They had never done that before.
Right.
And the house makes noise and things fall down and watching too many of the paranormal shows, you suddenly think there must be a ghost in the house.
Yeah, sure. You're binging on Netflix 12 hours a day. I mean, but there's also another side. You could be more open to the energy that surrounds you every day if you're in that space every day.
That's right. And the thing that people tend to forget is that, and it's something I always have to tell the ghost hunting world, is that the dead don't leave impressions behind, the living do. So when we pick up stuff in a place, it's often us that we're picking up. We're picking up our own stuff. We've had hauntings reported to us, and I've talked to people where they saw a figure coming down the hall towards them, and as it came into focus for them, they saw themselves. And it's because they saw essentially an imprint of themselves walking down the hallway. They were psychically open to picking that imprint up, and they saw that, and it freaked them out. And
opens up a bucket of questions, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The most commonly reported haunting is the sounds of somebody cooking in the kitchen when nobody's there. Think about that.
Wow. Yeah. It's the one room where you spend more time other than the bedroom.
It's the heart of the house, always. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. So last question, just to close it off, Loyd. For now, this has been a lovely conversation and an eye-opener. Very, very cool. What if we ask this of most guests, what does greatness mean to you?
I think greatness is it's knowledge and action in a particular, maybe a specialty that one has. But when I say knowledge and action, it is demonstrating not just that you know something, not that you can do something, but you bring people along with you. That you're not just simply up on a pedestal because you're great. And also, this is something I'm constantly telling people, because when we work with psychics and mediums, I run into a lot of divas and devos. And really what it boils down to, a big ego is great, but you need to admit you have it, and you need to have a sense of humor around yourself. So it shouldn't be so big that your head should not be so big you can't get in the house.
You got to care about sharing that knowledge.
You have to share your knowledge. I mean, people ask me, put me in the ghost hunter world. I see myself as a generalist and an educator more than anything else. I've specialized in field investigations. They're one of the reasons why I do so many of these podcasts and do so many sometimes guest spots for some courses and other people's stuff, is because I feel like people need to know that there's real information here and that there's real evidence.
Loyd, thank you for adding to that pool or ocean of evidence that we're collecting here from people who are sharing just the same. Thanks again, sir.
You're welcome.
Hey, it's Enrico Colantoni here, actor, director, and dedicated napper. Like what you heard today, there's more to come. Make sure to subscribe to Behind Greatness and learn about our live events at inspirenorth.com. You'll also find links to our social media right on our website, so be sure to give us a like and follow. Until next time, stay inspired.